thank you for coming, and welcome to both Ron and Nick for being here at this time. And for those who don't know, Ron got a master's at Monash University, and he's an emeritus professor at the ANC. ANU, my own writing, exactly. Now is director of the Paul Woodley Centre at the University of Technology of Sydney. And in 2011, he took up the chair of finance in the Waikato Management School in Hamilton, New Zealand. He's conducted several projects for organisations in the financial service sector. And his major research interests are the economics of fund management and superannuation industry, and also studies topics in corporate social responsibility. Nick Morris on my left is adjunct professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, graduate of Balliol College, Oxford, and was deputy director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies in the 1980s. In the 1990s, the CEO of London Economics, and then moved to Australia in 2000. He's been coordinating large infrastructure program and works also in China. He's researched and published a lot on pensions, and has very recently published this new book, Management and Regulation in the Pension Industry. So today we've got two studies of the Australian pension industry, which have wider implications, including to us here. So if each maybe talks for half an hour maximum, and then it gives us some time for discussion afterwards.
Thanks very much, Charles. Yeah, I mean, this has been my 50th year since I got my first academic job, but I did work for a few years. I left universities to run the asset consulting business for Taos Perrin in Asia, and then I went into funds management, and I've established 3 different funds management firms in Australia. I found that very boring, so I went back to universities, as I say to my students, because I didn't like work. But anyway, so I've kind of seen it from an academic side as an advisor to people who largely big pension plans and around Australasia or around Asia, and also from the funds management side, which is obviously where Paul Worley made his money out of funds management and put a small proportion of it into the Paul Worley centres around, in LSE, right, Toulouse and UTS. We've moved on from Paul though, Paul's moved on from us about 2 years ago. I've got too much material here because I'm no good at synthesising things, but I'll try and kind of, in the next 2 or 3 minutes, just summarise the whole story, and then we can go from there. I mean, the history of really, this is really a story in principal agency issues, really. That is really what is the bad aspects of the industry, particularly in Australia. I mean, where this started was 25 years ago, when the then Labor government decided to make compulsory contributions to superannuation, starting in 1992 at 3%, and that's the reason why the Australian system is so highly regarded, because it's meant to be quite stable. Because the contributions are mandatory. The contribution rate now is 9.5%, going to 12%, supposedly. I was at Taos Perrin when this came out, and I thought this is going to be really good for business, right? For consulting, it's going to. But what I said is, I swore under my breath and said, well, but this means there's going to be a whole host of people, a huge industry that grows up attracted to super as bears would be, that will bees to honey and things such as that, right? Because it's a huge pot of money there for them to tap. And I think, that's the truth of the matter. I'll show you on the next slide, but at the moment the so-called service providers will take about $35 billion a year out of the pot. And as you can see, this will probably go to about $150 billion a year by 2040, which of course in today's dollars is a bit less, but it's a huge pile of money. And I guess that I see, I mean, there's a particular issue here in principal agency theory. We all know principal agency theory, right? You actually employ somebody else to do something on your behalf because you either haven't got the time or the skill to do it yourself. You open yourself up to wealth transfers, right, from the agent to the principal, from the principal to the agent, and we got monitoring and bonding and all that as opposed to relief. But there's two aspects, particularly of the Australian Superannuation Fund and of financial services more generally, which are particular. I don't know if you saw the play by David Hare, The Power of Yes, the one on the play he wrote on the GFC. Right, it was he had Stuff Happens, which is the first one, which was on the George Bush administration. This was the third in the trilogy, and I saw it at the National Theatre, which is good because National Theatre is quite cheap to go to relative to lots of other theatres. And it was the best £15 or £20 overspent. But think about it. Think about this particular line of work. Well, there's two things about the superannuation scheme that separate it out. One is, well, I used to work in my sister's milk bar when I was young, and I used to eat lots of chocolate and eat lots of ice creams and things like that. But eventually I reached to a point of saturation. The good thing about this industry is there's no saturation when you're dealing with money, right? So there's no reason to actually put any restrictions on the amount that transfers the agent takes from the principal, right? There's no incentive to actually put a limit on it. You're not going to get, well, you might get sick, but it's maybe because you drink too much French champagne and things such as that. But it's not so obvious as eating a lot of ice cream. The second thing is that in superannuation you have a group of people as principals who are completely disinterested in what you're doing. If you have compulsory contributions and you can't do anything about those, right? They're taken anyway, and you can't touch the money, say, for another 30 or 40 years. As somebody in your 20s, you'd be silly to waste any time becoming stressed about your superannuation because it's kind of out of your control. The studies we've seen probably suggest that it's getting towards the 50s when people actually start showing any interest. So that means that the principal has a very long period of time where he can in fact do what he likes, largely unmitigated by the person who in fact owns the money. So, as I say to the students, if you're going to be in service, you're going to be a service provider in life, there's only one industry to be in, and it's the financial services industry. Because in fact, I mean, you're going to be able to extract greater wealth transfers there than you can in anything else that you could possibly ever do. So that's kind of the background, the story. Now, a couple of other parts of the story, and I was discussing this just a few minutes ago. I mean, the good thing about, obviously, if you build an industry which is clipping the ticket and taking 35 billion and growing each year, you actually produce a group of people who are very interested in maintaining the status quo. In other words, a very strong lobby group. And the thing that Super's got going for it, which not everything's got going for it, is indeed that it's just like motherhood. If you try and attack Super, you're just shouted down because it's naturally just a good thing. And why would anybody want to in fact do anything to in fact jeopardise what apparently is quite a good situation? So we have a very strong lobby group who really doesn't have to do much to convince the politicians and everybody else, in fact, that to leave things in a situation which is in fact designed to maximise the benefit of the service providers. Okay. The other thing about financial services in general, but particularly superannuation, is that competition doesn't make things better; it makes them worse. Because all the expenditure on service providers and everything else is on the argument that if we do this, we can actually get a better investment return, right? We can increase the amount of money flowing your way as members. But you've got to remember that investing is a zero-sum game. If A wins, B loses. All we're doing is, in fact, moving money around from A to B, increasing the amount of the size of the service sector, and the take of the service sector. In fact, Jack Bogle, it was Buffett has a great story on a parable on this, on a family that owned corporate America, right? So they the whole of all the companies were owned by this family, and what somebody came along, and it's effectively they thought was invested as a big index fund. They just sat on their investment. Somebody came along and said, well, if you actually try and trade in this and become active, you can do better, right? They went back 3 or 4 years later, and indeed nobody was any better off other than the amount that had gone off to these people, which are called brokers. Okay, well, then another group came along and said, well, yeah, it would work, but you've got to pick the right things to over-invest in and under-invest in, right? And they thought, well, this is a good idea. Okay, we'll do that. And 4 or 5 years later came back, and nobody was better off other than there was a bigger slice now which went to this new group, fund managers. And then somebody else came along and said, well, you've got to actually pick the right fund managers, don't you? And of course, people came back a few years later and found that the performance was the same. They were all about as equally as good off, except that now there was a third group who was actually taking money out of the pie. And then the story just goes on from there. And that's kind of the story of the industry in Australia as it stands up to now. Now, I mean, I will briefly try and identify some problem areas. Some of them are going to be different to Nick. I'm going to also maybe talk about some sort of solutions, some of which will be different to Nick, because I guess we come from a different background, I guess, anyway. But the bottom line is that have we got a reasonably good superannuation retirement income system in Australia? Yes, we have. Except for the principal agency problems that I've actually outlined before, which means that our estimates is that about 3% per annum is ripped off each year, either in direct or indirect costs, which results in everybody retiring on about half the amount of money that they would have if indeed this didn't happen. Okay. So let's have a quick look at a few things. I've taken up some of my time. I basically covered most of that stuff. As I said, the industry at the moment is 2.6 trillion, and that 35 million, I get problems with big numbers. That 35 million is 35 billion, should be, is what the service providers currently take out of the pie. Okay.
That's only 1%, isn't it?
About 1.25. About 1.25. These are the direct costs. I'm not even including the indirect costs in there. If I have a moment at the end, I'll talk about what they are without going into them in any detail. Okay, I mean, we have 3 pillars of our retirement income system. One's the compulsory contributions, one's voluntary contributions, and the other one is the age pension. The one that they don't talk about there is in fact housing, home ownership. This is probably the most important actually pillar of the retirement income system, and I'll touch upon that in a second. It was only a few years ago, it was the Murray inquiry, wasn't it? It said that maybe we should have an objective with our retirement income policy, right? We didn't have any objective up to them, so Treasury went away and came up with those 3. Provide an adequate retirement income, relieve pressure on the age pension, and give a pool of passive money, which largely passive money, or patient money as it says, capital to be used for investment purposes. Tax is an important issue. When they introduced compulsory super, and this kind of surprises me, they actually gave tax incentives. I'll come back to this, but why do you make something compulsory and then give people incentives to do it? It seems to me that, and I'll show you the import of these concessions, but contributions in Australia are taxed at 15%, earnings at 15%, and then any money you take out of the fund is not taxed at all. As we were saying beforehand, when you get to retirement, when you get to a pension stage, there's no tax either on earnings from the investments of the fund, which is kind of an incentive to keep the money in there for as long as you can. the cost of these, I haven't got a recent estimate, but the effectively these tax subsidies cost about as much as the age pension. In fact, by now the tax subsidies are bigger than the age pension. I mean, I'll say it now. I mean, to me, it's kind of ridiculous. During my lifetime, I will get about $800,000 in tax subsidies from the pension retirement income scheme. Okay, which is money. Which, you know, I'm not an overly wealthy person, but I could actually live reasonably well without that $800,000. People who, in fact, on low incomes actually pay a small price to actually be in it because they're taxed at 15% when most of their income would be not taxed at all because we don't pay any tax up to $18,000. So low income earners are actually made worse off by being forced to it, whereas wealthy people, the more wealthy you are, the bigger the tax subsidies you get. And I'll show you the numbers for that sort of. You were saying that we've got a good, well-ranked system. There's a number of surveys around the world, and they all put us up there with the Scandinavian countries as having the best in the world. Where, if you look at the purple here, the purple, that's a B plus. No one gets an A, but the people who get a B plus are the Netherlands, Denmark, and Australia get a B plus. They're the criteria. They're adequate. They're purely concerned that you're going to have enough to live in retirement. These people don't give a damn if you starve to death getting to retirement, right? They don't actually consider anything that happens up to retirement when they judge the scheme. So there's no account taken, and if I put money into a super fund, that's money that I don't have for consumption purposes early on, really. And I think that they're sustainable. Well, as long as they remain compulsory, they're sustainable, right? So, and the integrity of the scheme. Well, I don't know what you mean by integrity, but any compulsory scheme which is large enough where the take will in fact do very well on these criteria. That's the one that Mercer's do in Australia. But I mean, you see, it's 40 odd countries they actually cover at the moment. Well, as I said, I think the main problem with this is it only looks at life after retirement and doesn't look at the implications of the retirement instant scheme across a whole life cycle. What we've done anyway, and to get to it, and I'll have to quickly go through this, is we've modelled the Australian retirement income scheme at least as what it was in 2014. We have the Australian government through Hilda have actually good information on consumption by earnings levels. Okay, you know, the person on the 20th percentile of earnings, 30, 40, 50, in terms of on consumption, on all consumption items. So what we can actually do, and this is everything's generalised to the typical person. We can look at the income stream of a person on the 20th percentile, and we can look at the consumption of people on the percentile, and we can look at the tax and everything else, right? So what we've done is modelled the scheme up according to the rules that existed in 2014. They do change quite a lot, but they haven't since then, and looked at how it impacts on people. Well, on the 20th, 30th, 40th, 50th, 70th and 80th levels of income, okay, earnings. Because one of the problems with all the work in super, it's done on averages. And the scheme has a completely different impact on somebody depending upon what their earnings level are. For instance, in Australia, the bodies come out and say that you have to retire with a certain balance in your retirement, in the retirement fund, to actually be able to maintain your consumption post-retirement, right? But they don't recognise that the consumption post-retirement for somebody who's on the 20th percentile of earnings is completely different to the 80th percentile of earnings. The people on the 20th percentile of earnings don't need anywhere near the amount that the other people do to continue on. So those figures are just nonsense in terms of that. But that's what they're always talking about. Irrespective of whether I'm on the first percentile or the 100th percentile, I need this X dollars of retirement to live on. But there's a lot of mistakes done because of that. This is a little. So what we did was we modelled this using Monte Carlo simulations, I guess, where we had three things stochastic. One was investment earnings, one was consumption, and one was income. right? They were stochastic in the system, if that makes any difference at all. And we looked at the probability of somebody running out of money before they die, right, as one thing. That's a bad thing. And the second thing was maximising the present value of lifetime consumption. That's the good thing. So those were the two measures we put. We want more consumption, but we don't want to run out of money before we die. The only bit of social welfare in this whole study, and I'll get to it, is the age pension, because it doesn't say that anybody who runs out of money necessarily dies. And the second thing is, and the other thing we'll look at is housing, the impact on housing. But you can see there that super looks to be pretty good on that, right? This is the people on the earnings households, because this is all done on the average household. The probability of running out of money with super goes down, and the present value of lifetime consumption goes up, right? You can see by the way, the 30th percentile in Australia is the group where earnings equals expenditures. These are people who are effectively fully spending all their income on consumption goods, taxes and the like. So that's kind of the break-even point, or the kind of well, I don't know, call it a poverty line or whatever it is, but those people, if they take money out of their salaries, they have to consume less, is what it means during their lifetime. But based on those figures, you'd say, well, superannuation is doing its job, right? More lifetime consumption and less probability of becoming insolvent, I guess, and that. And you could leave it there. I pose two additional questions. Is the system a good use of taxpayers' money? And secondly, is it helping the right people? Does the system help the right people? The answer to both those questions is no, by the way, if we can't get to it. What I've done here is then added the age pension, which is really a safety net, right, for anybody into the system. It's not the most generous age pension in the world. It's not bad. It's not as good as the New Zealanders, which is non-mean tested and more generous than the Australian system. Ours is mean tested and less generous. But you can see there that the system actually works. By the way, nobody loses their job in the simulation that I've done, which we should do something about that and put in shocks into the system. But if I earn 20%, if I'm on the 20% of earnings throughout my whole life, and that does not, and I won't go into the pattern of that, but that's a little we have modelled that, I think, correctly, and with an age pension, I am going to probably not run out of money. That's if the government continues to index the pension, as they currently do. By the way, we're looking at people here out to about 2075. So, you'll probably be getting £1 million a year on the pension by that time with indexation, right? So it's whether in fact the government maintains that is a interesting question, but you can see here that with the pension no one runs out of money, and that you can see that where you can see the consumption figures. By the way, we do get some substitution. People who otherwise would take the age pension don't have as much of it. So there is some savings in the age pension because of this, and we'll look at those specifically in a moment. That's a little bit more interesting. This is the actual nominal consumption over your lifetime with no super, and you can see, for instance, the first one, that during a working life with no super, these people would spend $2.1 million on consumption. They would, in retirement, they would use $318,000 of their own on expenditure, but most of their expenditure would come from the age pension, and that'd be about $2 million. Remember, this is all nominal. They will die without leaving anything, right? On average, their estate. Even these people, though, with superannuation on retirement, you can see will leave an estate of 2.2 on average. an estate of $2.24 million to their to whoever they leave it to. You might think that is a big figure, but that's $2.24 million in about, what did I say again, 2075 or something. So it's not going to be worth a lot. That's not as big as it looks. It may buy you a 1 week holiday in the Gold Coast or something. But you can see, one of the things you see is that from here that for low income earners, their pre-retirement expenditure goes down by about between about 4 and 6%. So this is all based on a 10% contribution rate. So they lose about half. They have to they pay in 10,000, but their consumption falls during their working life by about 5%. Indeed, these people will never live as well as during their life as they will in retirement. Okay, and this is quite common. There'll be about a third of our population. If they get to retirement and get their hands on this money, their lifestyle will be much better than it has been for the last 60 odd years, right? Whether that's the outcome or not you want is certainly you won't live so well when you're raising a family of 2 or 3 kids and you live in a system. And by the way, I'm over at the moment at Cass at Business School where David Blake is. I don't know if you know David, the pension, but he's got some interesting work that says that nobody should put any money in the super until they're in their 30s, and then the contribution should go up exponentially. But yeah, if I look at the system as it is, it's completely useless for high income earners. They don't need compulsory super. If you look at what they typically consume, what they earn, and all of that, they're going to in fact save enough. Now there's going to be outliers, like there's going to be somebody who goes to races on Sunday and puts $1 million on the favourite in the first, and it loses. But typically, a typical person, a high income earner, doesn't need to be made to save for retirement. Okay, with or without tax subsidies. For what I'll show is for low income earners, it's not really doing anything any good at all. And there's a group in the middle where probably it has some vague purposes if in fact it was done well. This is no bad. This shows you this is the present value of the pension You can see for low income earners the pension. Their pension goes down. The present value of the amount they get of the pension goes down by a small amount, 136 to 22. Indeed, for the reasons I explained before, they're going to pay more tax because they're made to put into super, and that's after the government gives them a small subsidy, recognising their disadvantage. The small subsidy the government gives them doesn't in fact make up for the losses. But you can see down the right hand, down this column, the second last column, they're the actual present value of the pension subsidies that people get over their lifetime from indeed the system as it currently exists, and that's where I get my $800,000 from in terms of the benefits that I get. I'm saying that's $800,000 nominal dollars that I'm talking about. These are real dollars that I've got up there. But you can see why the system costs the government a fair amount of money, because of the huge tax subsidies that wealthy people get from the super scheme. Let's quickly move on. So that's one of the problems. I mean, we're using a lot of government revenue to, in fact, encourage people to invest money in the way which they have to do anyway. Okay. Now, the other thing that's happening in Australia is, in fact, that home ownership is going down, and it's going down quickly. The figures are not so bad because, in fact, but where the big drop-off in home ownership is in terms of young people who can't afford a house, and taking 10% of their income actually, I'll show, is the breaking point between able to afford a mortgage or not. Now I'm not assuming here. I'm assuming that everybody starts with no wealth when they start work, and that's obviously not true. And I'm not taking account of parents who, in fact, pay the deposit for their children, as I did for one family in Australia and one in London. And by the way, it didn't cost me much different to fund a child getting a house in Sydney and in London. There's not a lot different. But I didn't take account of this. So this is people starting with no income, building up enough to be able to buy a deposit and to pay a deposit. And you can see here the effect it has. Somebody on the 20th or 30th percentile will never buy a home in a major capital city of Australia, right? Unless they get assistance from somebody. Okay. You can even see there that someone on the medium income has got about a 40 to 50% chance of being able to do it, and the wealthier you can see there. But you can, if you look at the second column and the figures in brackets there, the figures are looking at a 20% deposit or a 10% deposit. But even with a 10% deposit, even the wealthy won't be able to buy a home. Now, this comes from the Hilda survey. That is, we are looking at buying a home which typically somebody at that income level would be able to buy. It's not that they wouldn't be able to go 50 miles out of Sydney and be able to buy a home, right? But that this is his chance of actually buying a home, which is typically the first home acquisition of somebody at that level of income. So you have to take that into account. But the thing that's only been recognised in recent years is if you take a lot of money out of people's salary, their ability to buy a home must go down quite a bit. And we're seeing the drop off in home ownership. And it's only really in the last little while that the industry has actually been willing to pay any recognition to the fact that maybe there's some association between loan ownership and having forced contributions to superannuation.
You've had your 30 minutes.
Okay, well, have I?
It's up to Nick.
Just give me a second. I mean, what I've shown is that if we continually get this thing about saying that of saying we should let people use the balance in their super fund to buy a first home, or at least low income earners to buy a first home, right? And what does the industry say every time that comes up? You can't do that. You know, you're taking money off it. They're going to actually suffer in retirement. They don't realise that actually owning a home makes a big difference on retirement. The way you can live on the age pension if you own a home versus if you're renting a home is horrific. You know, you'll be if you own a home, you may be able to afford to go to McDonald's once or twice a year. If you don't own a home, you won't be able to go anywhere, and even to get a ticket to go into town. I mean, the amount of money left over if you don't is in fact zilch. What I've shown is that if you let people actually use their deposit to buy a home, you would increase their welfare by 25 or 30%. In other words, the present value of their lifetime consumption would go up by 25 or 30%. Okay. The reason why, by the way, and there's a downside of this, what has been the return on home ownership in Australia over the last 30 years? Well, it's been about 20% per annum. Why is it 20% per annum? It's not because houses go up by 20% per annum, because they've only gone up by about 7 or 8, and the opportunity cost of not having to pay rent is about another 3%, which is like the dividend on a share. You get to live in the house as well as you have the capital gains. The reason is that if I'm a low income earner and I go to the bank and say I want to borrow some money to do this or do that, they'll tell you where to go. If you go in there and say I want to borrow some money to buy a house, they'll give it to you, right? So it's the only leveraged position that low-income earners can ever get into. And that's how the 8% goes to 20% over the lifetime of the loan, okay? What does the pension fund return during this period? 7 or 8% per annum, right? I mean, home ownership does so much more for low-income earners than the pension superannuation scheme can ever do. And the industry spends all its time trying to force people to not be able to buy a home. I mean, and use it to buy a home. And of course, who are they causing to suffer? Well, it's obviously just the low-income earners, the people who otherwise, because so many people otherwise could buy a home of some sort or other. Okay, I guess that's that paper. Can I just mention the other two? One thing I'll just mention. One of the unique features of the Australian superannuation scheme is what's known as self-managed superannuation funds. effectively you can opt out of the system where somebody runs the super fund for it and run it yourself. They are now the biggest, they're the biggest part of the whole superannuation scheme. About 28 or 29% of the assets are in self-managed super schemes, and they only started back in about, you'd probably know better, about 2000, bit 1990. So they've grown a huge amount. Now, we're spending a lot of time looking at these schemes. The interesting thing about these schemes, though, and let me show you one slide, is that we looked at the characteristics of the people who in fact run them. They have these interesting characteristics. They've got a higher risk tolerance, which is interesting. They have less financial literacy, which is interesting, because these are the people who are going to run money, have much control themselves. They trust advisors. People who in fact don't have self-managed funds totally distrust advisors. And fourthly, they're overconfident. In fact, they actually think they know a lot more than what they do know. Now, are these the type of people who you'd want to, in fact, have money managing their own money? Well, I'll leave you with that thought. There's a number of other problems with self-managed super funds I could point out. But Nick at the end is going to make some points about what's wrong with superannuation and and how to solve them. So let me just quickly mention the problems we see with superannuation. One is, and this is one that's it is lost, is the way that the game is played, and particularly the aim that everybody's trying to beat each other, results in less efficient pricing. In other words, more mispricing in capital markets than otherwise would be the case. And we've actually modelled this using GS. One of the big models? GS. What are they called models? Not dynamic models, but the big models of the firm, where we're fed into. This is Peter Dixon. I don't know if you know Peter. Of an economy, and seen what's the cost of the economy of in fact having mispricing in equity markets, and found that takes about 1% per annum off GDP growth. Right? So, so one thing is they create inefficient prices, misallocation of investment goods, lower economic growth, which is costing about 1%. Okay. Another one.
Better let's
get on.
You're crowding him out.
3%. Okay. One final comment then. Less competition we want. The aim should be for pension funds to try and maximise the pie, rather than their slice of the pie. Obviously, less service providers and a few other things. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ron. And
thank you.
Ron's given you quite a lot of vignettes of places where this is not all perfect. And both of us agree that these measures that put the Australian system up there as the best in the world are somewhat misleading. I've been looking at it for about 5 years, and the result is this book. Which was published about 3 weeks ago.
What's its title?
It's called Management and Regulation of Pension Schemes by me, Nicholas Morris. Okay.
I knew that last. Muzzle top.
Yes. So, if we just summarise how we got here and where we are, Australia did not introduce much of a state pension system. Unlike Britain, it just has a means-tested state pension. So for most people, there wasn't very much. And there were attempts to set up earnings-related schemes from 1913 onwards, and in 1938, which was stopped by the war, and then a number of times in the 1970s. And every time, a government suggests and then the next government gets elected and doesn't follow through. They have a shorter electoral cycle than the UK, and that means that long-term policy generally is quite difficult, particularly if you get the parties turning over. And as a result, the current replacement rate is the lowest in the OECD. That's the amount of money you get on retirement relative to what you had before. And poverty among the old is the worst in the OECD, according to the OECD's estimates. So it's not currently a good situation to be a retiree in Australia. Now, the attempt to solve this was the Hawke-Keating government, and it emerged from the wage bargaining process. And they were in a situation where they couldn't get the wage rises that they wanted. They were worried about inflation, but they thought that they could get a combined wage rise and superannuation contribution, which was better for their members. So that's really the motivation for mandatory contributions. And so they were introduced in 1991, took effect in 1992, and there are now funds in excess, as Ron said, of $2.5 trillion. So that's in excess of 1 year's Australian GDP. And these are expected to grow to 7 trillion by 2035. Now, to manage those funds, a rather complicated and expensive industry has emerged, and Ron gave you some of the reasons why that occurs. If you've got a layer, you make another layer, you make another layer. And most people think there are sort of 7 or 8 layers in the Australian system now. And although on the surface it looks diverse, and therefore there ought to be some competitive pressure and so on, in practice, collaborative links, so revolving doors and all sorts of things, mean that it's not. And colleagues at UNSW have done quite a lot of work tracking that down, and it turns out that it's really just 3 or 4 groups running the whole thing. Another issue in Australia, which I think is quite important, is that nobody's taking responsibility for regulating it. It's the regulatory responsibility is dispersed across a wide number of agencies. And that was partly deliberate. The Wallace inquiry didn't want one powerful regulator. They wanted, and took the view that one should divide by function. So you have a prudential regulator and a conduct regulator and so on. But the unfortunate effect of that is that nobody sees their prime responsibility as making sure that this industry runs well. Also, unfortunately, the legal changes that have accompanied have weakened basic trust law. There's a variety of places in which the SIS Act overrides the protections which would otherwise be in trust law. I'm sure Josh will comment on that, but that certainly colleagues at UNSW feel this. And there's a rather weak disclosure regime, which in particular means that the costs of fund management are not disclosed. So you do have to disclose, if you're a regulated entity, you have to disclose your costs, but you're allowed to outsource your fund management activities to someone else who only has to report the net return. They don't have to report the costs that they're incurring. So we've got these things in the Australian system which are causing the problems. So I asked myself the question, what has all this done in the period I have data for? And I took a 20-year period and I simulated what would have happened if we had simply taken the contributions and invested them passively in a fund with reasonable costs. And my reasonable costs are quite high, they're about 1%. And I find that the overall shortfall relative to the various benchmarks I test is between $700 and $900 billion. And that's about between 30 and 40% of the of the assets. So it's mirroring what Ron said earlier, that this is basically being removed by the industry from the funds of the pensioners. Just to give you a flavour of the kinds of things I tested, I've tested very simple portfolios where everything's invested in fixed and credit, or everything's invested in the All Ordinaries Index. But I've also looked at some particular fund portfolios, both from Australia and from internationally. And if you look down the left-hand column, you'll see that the estimated shortfall, it varies, but it's all in that range. I also did some benchmarking. I was quite interested at the fund level as to whether these funds performed well relative to funds in other countries. And I was very fortunate to be allowed to use a Canadian database, which contains Canadian, European and US funds. And for every fund I have detailed data on costs and returns and so on. And I know the portfolio, the benchmark it's trying to meet. So I've got its own portfolio. And so I'm comparing the outturn for those funds with the portfolio they say they're trying to match. And the blue dots are Australia and the red dots are the international funds. And the fact that most of the Australian funds are in the minus area shows that they don't do as well on these measures as the international funds. My explanation of that, partly we've been weak in cost control, and this chart shows you that. This is just the administrative costs of the Australian funds versus the international funds. But basically the pressures to control the behaviour of the industry are not there in Australia in the way that they perhaps are in the other three jurisdictions. America does probably have a bit more competitive pressure. Canada, the body politic takes more interest. And Europe does have some societal interest in these things. But Australia doesn't seem to have these controls, and as a result, the performance of the funds in Australia are not as good. So those were the two pieces of empirical work I did, and they're reported in the book. So why do we have these inadequate returns? Some of it is inappropriate asset choice given the risk profile we're trying to match. And one of the things about Australia is that the tax regime does push you towards equities. There are these things called franking credits, which if you invest in Australian equities, you can, and then you can offset those against anything. So it's very beneficial to be invested, and as a result, the Australian funds are heavily invested in Australian equities in a way that the international funds don't choose. So that's one of the things. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, yes.
Can you see that? I mean, one of the objections to the way pension funds in many countries is they more or less got out of equity.
Yes.
And for Australia, it seems to be very different. And you're saying that, are you saying it's bad or good?
It's more risky. And in the period that I've looked at, there have been several collapses in equity markets.
So the reason for the favouring of Australian equities is tax preferences.
Yes.
Can I just quickly add that why the hell did Paul Keating, who doesn't know much economics, do this? I mean, there's one argument that he precisely wanted a flood of money to go into the Australian mining industry to buy back the farm.
Sure.
So what you could describe as a distortion could have positive externalities for a nationalist who doesn't want to use foreign capital, but wants to try to establish a domestic capital base for ownership of resources.
Yeah, and there are counter-arguments. It is wonderful that we have such a strong financial sector in Australia. Without it, Australia would be suffering a lot. And it is also the case, as you say, that it's wonderful that we've put... I'm not exploring that. What I'm exploring is the movement of the wealth of the Australian pensioners into the hands of the investment industry. It is possible you could mount a counter-argument that overall this has benefited Australia.
It's a substitute for sovereign
But I think it would, yes, it's a substitute for a sovereign welfare. Anyway, if we can carry on with just my bit of it. There's anecdotal evidence that because people want to earn as many commissions as possible for themselves and their friends, there's excessive churn of assets. There's obviously higher costs than necessary, and it's about 90% active, or it was until recently 90% active managed. And they like active management because they get higher fees for doing it. But there's a lot of evidence to show that active management underperforms in aggregate passive management. Now, this has been allowed partly because we've got inadequate or inappropriate regulation, and in the book I go into that in some detail. We've got an overly complicated and hence costly industrial structure, and we've got conflicting duties of trustees and professional advisors. Now, the latter is because most of them are in big financial groups, and so one part of the financial group is doing the advice and another part is selling the products. So there's a very good man at UNSW, Anthony Asher, who's done a lot of work on the conflicts, and he's charted all the different conflicts, but it's huge. There's very big conflicts. Now, we got here because of incoherent policy processes, fees and charges, extensive outsourcing. Now, to some extent, the disclosure regime, I believe, has encouraged the outsourcing. We don't want people to know what we're costing, so we won't tell them. So we'll push it all out to our friends so that they don't have to tell them. And then complexity. Now, one of the things I've found most is that the higher the degree of separation between the principal and the people the agents that are actually doing the work, the worse the performance. I was particularly struck when I was looking at the fund level work at the outstanding performance of the Goldman Sachs and JB Weir fund, which is a particular fund, and somehow it manages to have exemplary performance with almost no cost, and that would imply at least some degree of cross subsidy and some degree of information sharing to achieve that. So the funds that seem to do best are the ones that are run on own behalf by companies, particularly the banks, for their own employees. And the funds that seem to do worse are the ones that are done for ordinary Joe Public, 7 or 8 degrees of separation away from the people doing the work. So the closer you are to the person you're advising, the more likely you are to do it properly. One of the things in Australia is that we drank the Kool-Aid about markets. We still believe that giving people choice and then relying on competition means that it will all be okay. And unfortunately, in this industry, because of some of the reasons Ron said, that we've got the principals are disengaged largely. It doesn't work, and we are beginning to realise that this sort of reliance on choice and competition really doesn't work. I won't go through these in detail, but there's a range of Australian decisions that affected that led to this. including the temporary raising of ceiling for contributions leading to rapid growth in the SMSFs and various tax decisions. That there's a hat tip needed to the Cooper Review, which about 6 years ago did look at this, and they came up with some suggestions which are helpful, to have rather more default funds and to try to bring the costs down, but it's not really had as big an impact as was hoped. Now, in the book, I start by with a sort of more theoretical, what should Australia have done? And I think there are three things you decide when you decide on your pension scheme. The first is pay-as-you-go versus funded. Given how poor the Australian pensioner is, and given this low replacement rate, it might have been sensible for the Australian government to try to help the current retiring population rather than some population 40 years in the distance. And the literature, which was available at the time they were making the decisions, of Samuelson and others, says that you can have a Pareto improvement through a pay-as-you-go system. So as long as your political system is stable and you continue to treat each subsequent generation the same, you can get a one-off gain for the current generation by giving them adequate pensions, and as long as and no future generation loses out to infinity. So that's the argument. Now, obviously, it requires very restrictive assumptions and so on, but certainly the pay-as-you-go versus funded, it's not absolutely obvious that having a big pool of savings makes a lot of sense. Now, that's also made worse, that situation, by my number 3, which is that if you do have a big pool of savings, then the industry will take them. So if you, but anyway, the second, which I think is very important and very relevant to Britain, is that defined benefit works better than defined contribution. And the reason for that is that individuals are not well placed to manage the risks that they face. And the principal risks are longevity risk and market risk. And in a DB scheme with 1 million other members, we can pool those risks, and then but if we're left on our own to handle those risks, the instruments that we need to handle them are not available to us. The annuity market is weak, and annuities are overpriced. And we've been discovering personally, when we've been doing our own pension, that the instruments available to you as an individual are just not there to do the hedging of the markets that are available to the institutional investors, certainly not in Australia. So it's much easier to handle the post-retirement risk in a DB scheme than in a DC scheme. So I come down on the side of pay-as-you-go and DB. Australia came down on the other side. And then the third, which I think is a slam dunk, is that we do not yet know how to regulate these industries in a way that prevents this extensive rent seeking. And I think the 700 to 900 billion that has been sort of hoovered out of the wealth is really very serious. It's sufficient in size to be macroeconomically important, and it certainly makes a huge difference to the living standards of the retiring population. If they had that extra 30 or 40% for their pension, it would make a very big difference to their welfare. There are a number of not smaller, but reinforcing factors. The lack of a proper risk management regime, all these cross subsidies that I've been talking about, meaning that there's a lot of distortions in the system, heavy reliance on active management, there's complexity. There's about 25 million people in Australia, and there's about 30 million funds, 30 million accounts. You know, most people have multiple accounts, which adds to the. Quite importantly, because our members are disengaged, we're relying on the trustees to represent their interests, but yet we haven't given very much attention to making sure the trustees are able to do that, either motivated to do it or with the relevant skills to do it. And so the performance of the trustees is quite weak. And we've got all these unintended consequences of the tax regime. And just to finish, it's very hard to know what to do. We've got a system which is entrenched, with huge amounts of money now being managed by a very powerful industry. And there's not much incentive for them to do anything. There's been, in the period I studied, which is a 25-year period now, there's been lots and lots of inquiries. Every inquiry says all the things I've just said, and very, very little is then done after the inquiry is finished. You know, there were academics. There are still academics who were saying all these things, and several of them, Drew and Stanford, were saying it sort of very shortly after the system was set up. You know, this is going to lead to A, B, C, D, E, all the things I've just said, and they were of course right. But that doesn't seem to change the behaviour of the political system. I do, in my book, there's a chapter which tries to go through the detailed changes you could make to trust law, to regulation, to competitive pressures, to these other things, and they would all be beneficial. But I think probably the most important single thing one could do is to set up something else which passively managed, low cost, properly governed fund into which everybody could put their money, which then provided a benchmark against which all the other funds were judged. And that might lead to some embarrassment, at least, in the industry, and might lead to some change in performance. It would also mean for the people that did move into it, we could introduce elements of risk pooling, which would overcome my second problem. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.